Pues para retomar la sesión de la mañana.
Welcome back. We're now going to be hearing from Luis González Reyes, who will talk to us by video conference and tell us about some of the pedagogical resources for an ecosocial fund education plan that they develop in FUHEM, an independent non-profit foundation that promotes social justice, democracy and environmental sustainability through educational activity and working on eco-social issues. Luis coordinates eco-social education in this entity since 2013. This encompasses multiple tasks, among which the creation of a curriculum with an eco-social approach for all educational stages and the development of curricular, interdisciplinary and eco-social didactic materials. In addition to this, he is also a member of Garúa, a cooperative that works on eco-social transformation. So he is also a member of the team that coordinates the training course for trainers in the Community of Madrid and is a regular collaborator of several universities. Also, he was a teacher at secondary education for 3 years and worked at the Hornillo Environmental Education Center. He's a co-author and author of a number of books, among which Educar para la transformación ecosocial. Luis, good morning. The floor is all yours. Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Wonderfully. The floor is yours. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this very nice and kind introduction. I'm going to be speaking Spanish. Unfortunately, I cannot speak Basque. Let me show you a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to be sharing my screen. Give me a few seconds for that. Right, let's talk about why and how we can have an eco-social approach to education. Right, let's look at some premises. First of all, we understand that the objective of education is to improve individuals and societies. Well, improving is a polysemic word, and we can interpret it in a number of different ways. We believe that improving is about making more democratic, fairer, and more sustainable societies, because this will lead to a collective good and individual good as well. This is basic function of teaching and education. On top of this, education needs to have a look at the present, at the things we need to learn in the present, but also look at the future, what we're going to be needing in the future. So this is a systemic crisis we're undergoing, a very deep one that is related to a social crisis, economic crisis, and also a crisis from the viewpoint of the environment. So we cannot educate as if nothing were changing. We cannot educate as if our situation wasn't changing. And so this is something we need to take into consideration. So in order to work from an eco-social perspective, we can do a number of different things. From our perspective, what's essential here at school is to be present in important spaces, key spaces at school, where we work with students. So this is what happens in the classroom, everything that has to do with the curriculum, with the objectives, the contents, the method, and the assessment mechanisms. Right, so what should we be learning in terms of eco-social objectives? Well, we should learn that we are now undergoing a change in civilization. We need to assume that, and we need to understand that the future is completely open. We need to accept that high level of uncertainty. We need to be able to meet our needs autonomously, because some of the factors we are now undergoing have been questioned due to the pandemic. We need to understand that we are profoundly eco-dependent beings and assume that that's a key lesson we need to learn at school. And as a consequence of that, we need to have this attitude of maximum respect to life and the ecosystems, because this is something we depend on. And as a consequence of this, we need to integrate ecosystems in a harmonious way. So this is the first pool of things we need to learn. Then we also need to learn that we are interdependent. We need to be looked after by other people's. So we need to assume that interdependence, this reality of ours, which is a very nice reality, and therefore we need to value equality and democracy. If all of us are eco-dependent and interdependent, we need to be looked after by others, and this naturally leads to the need to articulate equal societies where we can enjoy this interdependency. We need to live in democratic societies where we can make decisions as well. So, on the other hand, our societies are unequal and not very democratic. So we need to analyze the mechanisms that are at the very core of our societies to change that. The fourth learning block is related to help people if they want to become agents of social change. They need transformation tools from an eco-social perspective, a non-violent one. They need to see themselves as agents of change. If we don't believe we're capable of changing societies together with other people, we won't be able to achieve that goal. So we need to think beyond languages or maths or English, which of course is something we need to learn. And we need to get elements that help us meet the challenges ahead of us as societies and as a species as a whole. So what's the methodology we're going to be using here? Well, this is fundamental from the viewpoint of transformation and transforming our educational practices. This method we're going to be using will not be neutral. There are some methodologies that have different perspectives. So what are the elements we can include in our methodologies to include the eco-social perspective? For instance, if we look at inequalities in the planet or the environmental impact of human activity, this is not transformative. What's transformative is to be able to feel inequality and to feel those environmental impacts. We need to place emotions at the core of our learning process. It's always been there. They've always been there, but we need to be fully aware of that. We need to work on empathy, for instance, concerning other living beings and other humans. If we want to learn in a transformative way, well, that learning process needs to be aimed at action, where students are not just at the core of the learning process, but also at the core of small changes in their environment, in their families, in their at their schools. So this needs to be there in the learning practice. So we need to build knowledge collectively. This is key as well, because now we know this is the mechanism that helps us learn more and faster. This is about build a democratic construction of knowledge. This has to do with the eco-social perspective, and this is key, not to have a manipulative type of education, and education where people need to make their own decisions, need to generate their own learning process in interaction with other people, and we shouldn't be dogmatic here with students. So we need to think about the different elements that we have on the table that are based on a number of different experiences of cooperative learning, and that leads to a number of different resources that are available for us. Collective learning is therefore key, but it also needs to be active. Students are not objects, but rather subjects and agents in their learning process. And finally, we need to have a holistic and critical look at things, because our problems are very complex, they're interrelated. And it is key to understand this and to have this critical look at everything. I mean, especially the main elements of our society. We need to criticize them, and we also need to be very critical with the alternatives we are suggesting. And this has to do with the methodology we're going to be using, of course.
And the last aspect that I wanted to talk about with regard to the curriculum is assessment, because assessment is very important in our teaching practices. It's very important Because if we've been working on ecosocial goals and we've adopted an ecosocial approach, but then if we don't assess it, if we don't evaluate, then the message that we're sending out to students is that it's not actually that important. Because when push comes to shove, it's evaluation, it's assessment. That's the process in which we see whether students have actually acquired the capacities that we have tried to teach them. And if we don't evaluate, if we don't assess whether or not they've actually acquired these values, then we're not attaching the importance that we should be attaching to that, and we're actually sending them that message. And in fact, we're not engaging in good teaching practice either, because we're not going to know whether or not we've actually achieved our goals. So we need to go through this evaluation process, this assessment process of the ecosocial approach. So it needs to be an assessment which is sort of the last ditch control and monitoring of what we've done in the classroom. We need to make sure that it's not an element of power. It needs to be a process. It needs to be a collective process, a mutual effort between those who teach and those who learn. So we need to really sort of turn it all on its head. But what happens when we actually try to do that? Well, if we don't have a series of materials which will enable us to actually implement this curriculum, then the effort's just going to be huge, because we need a good programming for what we're working on, different social issues, eco-social issues, art, literature, mathematics. It might be okay to know what we have to do, but then we actually have to do it. And making and compiling good teaching materials is very difficult. It's very complicated, because you need to understand what you're teaching, but you also need to have a very good knowledge of methods. You need to have a holistic overview of the entire process, and I have to have time to do it, of course. And let's not kid ourselves. Teachers usually don't have this time. I mean, people who work in the educational community know this. They don't have that time available, and they often don't have the skills required to compile teaching materials. So we need to make their life easy for them. We need to provide them with materials that are going to enable them to adopt this ecosocial approach. But these materials also fulfill another very important function, because it's not just students that learn. We all learn. Teachers learn. We learn about so much from the material that we use. So these materials that we're going to be developing, it's not just a way of training students, it's also a way of training teachers. So we have a synergistic type of tool in which we actually will be transforming two key elements of the educational community. And in fact, not just two, but I would even say three. Because often our children come home with doubts, and they ask their parents for help. So their parents read the material, their parents are exposed to the materials. So in fact, it's families as well. It's students, teachers and families. All of these stakeholders learn from these materials. So it's not a magic recipe. It's not the silver bullet, but it's definitely a tool that's going to help us. So I'd now like to describe two proposals for resources. One is a blog that we've been working on for a couple of years now. Every Wednesday we publish on this blog a new teaching resource. Sometimes they're resources that have been developed by other teachers from other places, and others, sometimes it's resources that have been compiled by other organizations. We've classified them into different topics and subject areas, and at different levels as well. Materials for primary school, for preschool, for secondary school. And they're also classified with a series of labels so that you can search for resources which include the gender perspective or climate change, etc. So it's basically a resource bank that we add to week by week, and it's available to anyone who wants to use it. So we've also been engaged in a more ambitious project, and this is materials or resources for secondary school. And it's important to have a different set of approaches here. One is a multidisciplinary approach, because we're talking about an issue that we have to look at from multiple perspectives, then we need to provide that. So we have tried to develop multidisciplinary resources and materials which would learn from and draw from project-based learning, but were adapted to the needs of secondary schools and their teaching staff. Because often a situation in which students choose what to study and the teachers help them, they're just there to help them, this is great. It's very gratifying, it's very enriching, but it's also very time-consuming. We understand that. So we have a project in which we present a set of materials which will help teachers, because it's the material itself that actually enables all of this. Students can't choose what to study because we choose it for them, but it actually makes it easier to work from this multidisciplinary approach with several different subjects focusing on the same issue. So there's an initial phase which has to do with motivation, and then the idea is for each teacher, for example, if a maths teacher that goes into the class, in their timetable they have material, but it's actually coordinated with all the other subjects as well. So the idea is to break away from sort of this timetable cage in which we're in order to work all together from a multidisciplinary approach on a single issue. This ecosocial approach is embedded in the entire project, the entire activity. We've also tried to make sure that they're flexible in a number of different ways. So flexible in the sense that not all subjects have to be involved. Obviously, if one subject isn't involved, then you have to perhaps just reinforce or change the context of other subjects. And also, we understand that teachers need materials that they can adapt, that they can appropriate, they can make their own. We propose one, but then we provide many more resources that can possibly be used to enable teachers to kind of create and to generate their own teaching pathways and to come up with other ones, come up with new ones. And this is what many of the teachers who work with our materials in fact do. We've also tried to make sure that our resources take into account the diversity that is present at the moment in school classrooms, different learning paces, different learning needs. So we're not necessarily thinking so much about the specific curricular competencies that they need to acquire, but rather the idea is to provide complete frameworks and scaffolding for learners. So there's more scaffolding for those who need more scaffolding, less for those who perhaps are further ahead. And then finally, we're thinking about methods which are based on the collective construction of knowledge. This is an important part of our methodology as well. So I would just like to show you some of them, just by way of example. What you can see here is for the first year of secondary school. It's articulated around the idea of the fact that all living beings form part of a single ecosystem. Now, this is not just a scientific theory. This is something that has actually been confirmed. And so we launch it as an issue of debate, and then we explore it in a number of different ways. And there are two subjects. In geography and history, we explain this sort of the organic theory. We talk about the biosphere, the cryosphere, etc. And then in English and in civic values, we talk about the different value system. We would talk about the way what would happen if there really were a macroorganism of which we formed part? What would that value system look like? And in the other subjects, we can accompany this. They accompany all of this. So we start with a trigger, as we call it, a civilization, which did exist in ancient times, called Arapa. And we have a series of clues that they have to follow to try to make it more interesting and motivational. and they work with different elements. Some have to do with flavors or codes, and they have to resolve different enigmas and puzzles to get them think about the idea that the Earth in fact might be alive, and the different types of civilizations that have existed in the past. Now, in biology and geography, these are the main axes, the main subjects in which we explain the contents. Now, it can be really hard if you start secondary school for students and then you're just doing exactly the same thing in biology and geography, but you don't, because you're looking at it from a different point of view. So in biology, we see how life has created our atmosphere, and we explain how water is basic and vital for life, and how soil that is vital to life, but it's also life that creates soil. And then in geography, when we're looking at atmosphere, they don't look at what gases make it up and how those gases are created. They look at different elements, for example, how life regulates everything in order to enable the optimum temperature for the development of life itself. We look at CO2, etc. We also see how life is able to recycle materials and use them many different times, because at the end of the day we have a limited planet, limited resources, and we haven't got any new sources coming in. And moreover, we can see how the Earth has actually been able to recover from different problems and catastrophes, and how some species have become extinct, for example the dinosaurs, and how the Earth itself is extremely resilient. And in the other two subjects, in ethical values and English, which also focus on this same theme, we also see how we could develop a system of values which would fit into this idea, the fact that the Earth and all its contents just form one huge microorganism. And then in ethical values, they see a character, a girl, you can see her on the screen, and she tells us about her life, and she explains how she's got to where she is now by studying, for example, the Earth Charter, and coming to a different way of thinking. And then in English, they visit 3 different cultures, the Inuit, the Sar and the Quechua cultures, which have different ideas about how we should look after the Earth. And it's all in English, of course, because this is English as a subject. Now, the other example that I wanted to show you is another resource that we have developed, again, for the first year of secondary school. In this case, the central theme is the Mediterranean. Now, here the logic is different. We put students in the classical Greek civilization in the middle of the Mediterranean, and we explain how they travelled in that era. And all the different subjects they go on a journey. And they have different characters who accompany them on these journeys. So, for example, in the trigger, we talk about how people travelled in the classical Greek times. And these are the different characters who are going to be accompanying them. So, for example, in geography and history, they become a crew of people who come from different parts of the Mediterranean. And we talk about civilizations in Africa and Asia to sort of get out of the Eurocentrism. And they split up into different expert groups, and they can see what the political organization of Greece was, how women lived, how slaves lived, what was the city planning, how were the arts during that time, through different characters and expert groups to get a much more complex view of classical Greece. Because it was, the people who were, leading the society lived very well, but not everybody lived in the same way. Maths, what do we do in maths? They get a challenge at the beginning, and they have to learn a lot of things in order to be able to rise to the challenge and complete the challenge. The character is Lemio. There, it's an X who's missing his head, and he's got to go and try and find his head. In English, they choose their own adventure. We have Hasson, Atalanta, and Hippakia, I think she's called. They accompany the different groups, And each working group is going to follow a different route around the Mediterranean, because they have to go and try and find or complete their challenge. In Spanish and literature, they follow the journey taken by Ulysses in the Odyssey, and they study the Odyssey. They learn about, they do text, they study different types of text and grammar. So, the approach is more holistic. We don't separate grammar and literature, we do it all together. And then we go on a journey through time. We say, right, well, we've looked at classical Greece, but how do we travel around the Mediterranean at the moment? What are the migratory flows in today's Mediterranean basin? And they have to use what they've learnt in the different subjects and prepare a project in which they show and they demonstrate what they have learnt in literature, in language, and in history, for example, and apply all that to current day, modern day migrations in the Mediterranean basin. Just very briefly, let me just show you some other resources. For the second year of secondary school, we have a topic on the city, especially focusing on codependence and how we consume goods and energy and how we depend on others. For example, we have the fossil fuel limits. We talk about a number of different issues, and we talk about what possible futures we could have. Utopian futures and dystopian futures. And this dystopian futurism is one of the main issues that we work on. So we're just combining different subjects. And then this all comes together in the final project, which has to do with their local neighbourhood. And in the third year of secondary school, we have a resource which focuses on love. And we just, we try to talk to students about how often schools become places of hate, and everything is articulated around hate. And so this was sort of a dystopian future, and then we take them back, they time travel back to the present time and say, look, we don't want this future to happen. We don't want our school to be articulated around love. We want it to be articulated around, we don't want it to be articulated around hate. We want it to be articulated around love. So what can we do to prevent this future? And we talk about empathy, passion, different aspects of love. And different groups work on different aspects. And as we work on literature, we talk about freedom as well. Or as we work with music, we work on passion and what elements we can use to articulate passion. So we have different subjects working on this whole idea of love. And then the project has to do with changing the school so that it can be articulated around love rather than around hate. And just to finish, in the fourth year of secondary school, we have two units. One, which is focused on modernity, and this historic moment in which we have culture and nature, man, woman, private, these sort of polar opposites that articulate our modern society. And they work on this from the point of view of the scientific method, which is another tool which has been developed in modernity, science and the scientific method. And at the end, they end up doing a project in which they can see what values of modernity are prevalent in their school today. And then the last topic is the longest one that we have so far. Again, it's the fourth year of secondary school. It's done throughout the last term of the fourth year of secondary school. And the idea is to focus on the current world. And we look at it from a number of different perspectives. The games generally is the main method used, and through different games and recreational activities, students learn many different things. And the end project is to design a board game, which incorporates all the different elements that they have learned. And all of this includes an analysis of the inequalities of our modern world, and in fact that are at the heart of the structure of our modern world. So that's, I think, all from me. If we have time, I'll be happy to answer any questions. And I hope it was all clear enough for you, so that you had a very clear idea of our proposal and some of the materials that we develop.
Un aplauso para Luis.
Warm round of applause, please, for Luis.
Luis, qué maravilla.
Luis, wow, it's wonderful to listen to you. I don't know what you were thinking, but I was thinking as I was listening, wow, how can they come up with such a fantastic set of resources which are so varied and so full of nuance? So we have time for a Q&A. I don't know if there is anyone here in the room who wants to ask a question, or if anybody wants to ask a question over the YouTube channel. Otherwise, I'll start. Luis, you talked about assessing with an ecosocial approach. So how does that go? It's true. We're in a society in which it seems that if you don't evaluate something, then it's not worth anything. How can you evaluate or assess students with an ecosocial approach or perspective? Well, the first thing to point out is that it is something that we still need to work on. We haven't finished doing it yet. We haven't finished developing it yet. But just a couple of reflections. When I was talking about assessment, I'm talking about assessment that isn't used to sort of rank students, but will help us learn. That's its main aim. And it's true that we live in, within a legal framework in which we have to award grades and marks to students, but it makes much more sense to assess throughout the course of the learning process rather than only one assessment right at the end. Because if we see how students are going, then, and we can see that something's going wrong, then we can help students early on to refocus so that they can do better. It's the aim of assessment isn't to award marks and grades. It's to help students to learn what they're not learning. Because if I can see where they're going wrong, then I can, develop the means or the resources, or give them the resources to help them get back on track, either through peer learning or through the teacher. So that's the main aim. But there's something else as well that I think we ought to bear in mind. When we're talking about different assessment tools, we have good tools developed to assess the conceptual goals, for example. So students have learned this. Also procedural, with procedural assessment is pretty good. But when we're trying to assess attitudes, the attitudes that they have acquired, that's really difficult. And why is it so difficult to assess attitudinal characteristics? Well, because the values that we have really are only manifested through our behavior. And of course, this is mainly is influenced by society. If I'm faced with a teacher who wants me to say that I separate my waste, and I know they're going to give me a mark depending on what I say, well, I will separate it. Or if I have to show them that I do it, I will do it, but I might not agree with it. I might not think it's important, but I'll do it because this is what is expected of me. So you get a lot of false positives, and you also get a lot of false negatives as well, because if we just observe, when we work with adolescents, for example, often adolescents just disagree with us just because they're adolescents and they want to disagree with us. But in fact, they do share our values. They're just disagreeing with us because we're in a position of authority and they're teenagers. So it's very difficult to actually assess attitudes. And this is something that we do need to work on. We all need to make sure that we provide them with a space in which they all feel free. And maybe teachers aren't even there. And if teachers are there, they need to perhaps change the way in which they work. And then just one last idea before I finish. If in what we really want to do is to develop education which is liberating and not manipulative, then when we're assessing our aims and our objectives, especially those related to attitude, we have to leave space for people to dissent, for people not to agree with us, so that students can argue. As long as it's a justified argument, they can say, look, for example, recycling. I don't think we should recycle because of this, this and this, with justified arguments. There needs to be space for that. It's not just a case of making sure that students think exactly the same as we do. the idea is that students will be able to think about everything and build their own values and their own value system. I mean, that's very, very complicated, but of course it's much richer and much more interesting. And from my point of view, it is absolutely vital as well. Thank you very much.
Pues sí, por favor, una pregunta.
There's a question here from the floor. José Manu Gutiérrez Bastida. I know who you are, so hello. Luis, my name is José Manu. Fantastic presentation as always. Congratulations. Just a question, and I know you and me have talked about this before, but in this innovative approach that you have just presented, when will you be talking about, you're talking about objectives. When are you going to stop working for outside objectives and start working using other objectives which are much more in accordance with what you're trying to do? Yes, I agree. This is one of the deficits, I think, of what we're doing. This sort of the external framework which is imposed on us. In this approach that we've developed, I think we've struck a compromise between going further, some steps further in some areas, and then just sort of settling for what's feasible in other areas. So the material that we're offering is material open to everyone. It's open to teachers, to schools, and I'm sure there are things that we did wrong. And one of the things is what you're saying, José Manu. And you're right. I mean, I'm not going to try to defend what we're doing. It's true. It's one of the shortcomings of what we're doing. There are more. It's not the only one, but it is one of the deficits of what we're doing. Because we haven't dared to go sort of further outside the box. But hopefully in the future, we will find a way forward.
Sin duda que es importante, ¿no? No solo poner en valor.
Yes, I think that's important. Important not just to highlight the good things, but to highlight the shortcomings as well. Are there any other questions? I'm going to ask you one last question. Now, I know that in a very cross-cutting way, you talk about and you work on lots of human values and human rights, but do you do it explicitly? Do you name them, these human rights, in your resources? Well, yes, we do. I think we do both things, really. We don't just say, this is the human right to I don't know what. No, but they are there. They're mainstreamed throughout everything. So, for example, in the last topic that has to do with inequalities, well, of course, human rights are everywhere, intrinsically. So we do work on them indirectly. But we also work on them directly in some of the subjects and in some of the topics. We do make specific mention of the human rights, and we study them, etc. And we sort of attach value to them. So we do both things at the same time. I showed you a number of examples of the different resources that we've developed, and that is true of that. But in the blog, on the blog as well, we publish on the blog different specific resources that focus specifically on human rights. Most of them developed by other organizations which have done a fantastic jobs. And if they've done a fantastic job, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. If it's there, we just use it.
Muchísimas gracias, Luis.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's been a pleasure having you here with us, and a warm round of applause, please, for Luis.
Pues nada, muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is a privilege for me to be heard. So thank you very much.
Qué ricasco. Hasta pronto.
Thank you very much. See you soon.